But in reality, liberal democracy is not universal at all. It's rigidly Western. It talks about freedom and equality, but only under its own terms. It decides what it means to be free, what it means to be rational, what it means to be educated, what it means to be civilized. And if a society doesn't fit that mold, it's labeled as backwards, illiberal, in need of saving, in need of liberal democracy.
Members, the motion before the House tonight is that this House believes that liberal democracy has failed the Global South. To open the case for side proposition, I call on Ms. Arwa, who's a first-year PPE student and elected members of the Secretaries Committee.
Thank you, Mr. President, for this opportunity, and good evening, everyone. To begin, I'd like to make one thing very clear. Ideologies in and of themselves do not fail or succeed. Liberal democracy, like any other ideology, is just a set of ideas. It cannot do good or bad things. It can only be mobilized by people to do good or bad things. An ideology does not have agency. The people who wield it do. And that's why in today's debate, we shouldn't evaluate liberal democracy solely as a theoretical ideal. We need to look at how it has been used, what it has failed to prevent, what it has been used to justify. From that perspective, liberal democracy has failed the Global South because it has, both historically and in the present, been weaponized by the West as a tool of domination, facilitating the imposition of foreign Western values and interests onto the Global South, often in ways that go directly against its needs. Liberal democracy has always been a tool, first of empire, and now of global Western hegemony. But before I get into all that, it falls upon me to introduce speakers on side opposition. Speaking first, we have Asad Iqbal. Now, when I heard I was speaking against Asad, I knew I'd struggle to think of any proper criticisms. He is genuinely one of the sweetest people here at the Oxford Union. He is supportive, he is moral, he is kind, he has values, which really makes you wonder, what is he doing here at the Oxford Union? But don't fret, I did ask around and found out that Assad was one of the key supporters of Imran Khan's bid for Oxford Union chancellorship. Now, when that didn't work, it seems like he took the next best Khan alternative, President Khan. A true patriot. Next, we have Ambassador Georges Frieden, Luxembourg's current ambassador to the UK and former ambassador to the EU. Fresh from the world of European diplomacy, I'm not at all surprised that he's arguing on side opposition. After all, from the ivory towers of Cambridge to the corridors of Brussels, democracy looks great when you're the one shaping it. Next, we have Ambassador Kurt Volter, former US ambassador to NATO and special representative to Ukraine under Trump. Ambassador Volter, I hope you had a good flight from America. I know the culture shock here from the UK and the US can be quite extreme, but I'm sure working under Trump's administration, you were surrounded by vipers, so the union shouldn't be any different, really. Now, finally, we have Professor Surya Subedi, a distinguished international jurist and academic with a notable track record in international law and human rights. He's a strong advocate for liberal democracy, but I'm not too sure how successfully, having helped draft Nepal's stable constitution, which has seen 12 governments in 16 years. Mr. President, these are your guests, and they are most welcome. Now, to say that liberal democracy has been mobilized as a tool of oppression and domination shouldn't really come as any kind of momentous revelation to anyone. From its inception, liberal democracy was inseparable from empire, not only facilitating oppression, but actively legitimizing it. Western policymakers, philosophers, and scholars all advocated for liberal democracy as a universal model of governance, principles, and values. But in reality, liberal democracy is not universal at all. It's rigidly Western. It talks about freedom and equality, but only under its own terms. It decides what it means to be free, what it means to be rational, what it means to be educated, what it means to be civilized. And if a society doesn't fit that mold, it's labeled as backwards, illiberal, in need of saving, in need of liberal democracy. This was how liberal democracy was used as a tool to justify intervention, assimilation, and domination for centuries. It wasn't just a political system, it was a missionary project. For example, Britain framed its colonization of India as a moral duty to bring liberal enlightenment to backwards people, to develop an allegedly inferior society. The same logic was applied to indigenous peoples in Native America, likewise by the French in Algeria. The insistence of rigid liberal democratic values, labeling anything that is incompatible with them as inherently illiberal, has meant that even when liberal democracy is used to address oppression, it often misses the target. This was also clear in the collapse of Western intervention in Afghanistan. Western powers cast themselves as democratic saviors, promising freedom and modernization. They painted a stark, dichotomous moral battle between the oppressive Islamic order and all of its illiberal, extremist, tyrannical values versus the enlightened capitalist West. Nowhere was this clearer than in the West's hyperfixation over the veil as the ultimate symbol of oppression, compared to the free Western woman. Thus, the choice that Afghans were presented with was not a choice at all, but an ultimatum. Accept the modern liberal democratic order of the West, or remain chained to their Islamic values, cast as inherently incompatible with progress and freedom. For Afghans, this was not emancipation, but foreign domination, draped in self-righteous rhetoric. The Taliban capitalized on this, easily painting the Western project as culturally imperialist. The consequences of failing to focus on the true source of oppression can still be seen today. Now, of course, a conversation on the oppressive nature of the liberal democratic order would not be complete without talking about its economic dimension. Even after nations in the global south won their independence, Western liberal democracies still found new ways to impose their value preferences, this time through economic control. How? Through economic assistance, structural readjustment programs. The message to the global south was clear. You will receive aid, but only if you open your markets to the so-called blessings of free trade and liberal economic policy. Real blessings, but certainly not to the global south. The policies of deregulation, privatization, and austerity that countries like Zimbabwe, Ghana, and Senegal had to adopt meant that the role of the state was minimized. Domestic industries were left unprotected, and nations were pushed into a global marketplace that they simply could not compete in. The results? Great. If you're in the West, you got cheap resources to exploit cheap labor and new markets to tap into. But the global south, their developing industries collapsed under global competition. The drain from the global south through unequal exchange totaled $62 trillion in real terms. If this value had been retained by the south and contributed to southern growth, it would be worth $152 trillion today. Now, this isn't just an unfortunate side effect of free trade. It's the system working exactly as it was designed. Wealth was extracted from the periphery and funneled back into the imperial core. Structural readjustment programs, far from creating prosperity, facilitated the greatest peacetime transfer of wealth in history. Of course, we could not have a speech on liberal democracy without also talking about its inherent hypocrisy. How many times have liberal democracies used rhetoric of liberal democratic values to justify military interventions, regime changes, and outright war, only for those same interventions to install dictators and suppress independence movements? The answer is at least 70 confirmed cases by the United States alone since 1947. Take Iran in 1953, where the US and the UK overthrew the democratically elected prime minister after he nationalized Iran's oil industry, only to install the Shah, ushering in decades of authoritarian rule. Again, Iraq in 1958, where when a nationalist uprising overthrew the Western-backed monarchy, the US orchestrated yet another coup. Fast forward to Libya in 2011, the Western intervention left a failed state plagued by civil war. Then there's Egypt. For decades, the US supported Hosni Mubarak's dictatorship, and when Mubarak's successor was overthrown in another coup, they immediately backed his replacement, another authoritarian leader. And what of Palestine? Here, the West's commitment to human rights is nowhere to be found. We see not intervention, but complicity. The same powers that claim to uphold liberal democracy fund and arm an occupation that has dispossessed an entire people for over 75 years. This is the reality of liberal democracy as practiced by the West. Now, you might argue that in these actions, the West was not practicing true liberal democracy. But if Western governments claim to be liberal democracies, but consistently act in ways that betray those principles, then either A, liberal democracy is too weak to prevent imperialism, oppression, and domination, or B, liberal democracy is simply a convenient ideological mask for imperialism, oppression, and capitalistic domination. Either way, the conclusion is the same. Liberal democracy has failed the global South. Thank you.